is getting desperate. As long-range Ukrainian drone strikes have become a weekly occurrence, Vladimir Putin has to face the fact that Russia's air defenses aren't working. Russia pretends that they are. The drone debris excuse used every time Ukraine scores a direct hit on a target inside Russia is proof of that. But the reality is far different. Russia is desperate. So desperate that Putin is begging Turkey for help because Ukraine has crushed his air defenses. The big question now is, will Turkey answer Putin's call? On September 13th, Defense Express reported that Russia has put out feelers for a potential buyback of the S-400 surface-to-air missile defense systems that it sold to Turkey. The outlet says that a shortage of these air defense systems, which are among the most advanced Russia is capable of fielding, is one of Putin's biggest problems when dealing with Ukraine's long-range strikes. To Russia, the buyback makes sense. Turkey isn't using the S-400s it's bought from Russia, as we'll explain later in the video. And the missiles Russia initially provided are soon going to require Russian maintenance anyway. So Putin is offering a deal to Turkey. Sell your S-400s back to Russia and put the money towards something that you will actually use. If Turkey says yes to the offer, then we already know what Russia will be receiving. Russia sold 4 of its S-400s to Turkey back in 2017 at a total cost of $2.5 billion. That amounts to about $625 million per unit, which is a pretty large outlay for a single weapon. What isn't known is what Russia is offering for these systems. A like-for-like buyback would probably be Turkey's preference, as it doesn't want to lose out on the initial $2.5 billion it spent. However, Russia may try to make the case that Turkey isn't using these weapons, so it's better to claw some money back rather than letting the weapons rot in a storage facility. Russia's offer is on the table, even if we don't know the particulars. The big question is simple: will Turkey say yes? As obvious a question as this is to ask, the answer isn't simple in the slightest. Turkey has long walked a tightrope between Russia and the West. On one hand, the country is a NATO member, as well as a country that has applied for European Union or EU membership. That EU application has been on hold for years, with the EU having voted in May to keep Turkey's accession process frozen amidst concerns about the country's lack of true democracy. That vote passed with 367 in favor of freezing, 74 against, and 188 abstentions. Still, these memberships and desired memberships show that Turkey absolutely wants to build stronger ties with the West. On the other hand, Turkey hasn't exactly cut Russia off as a result of Putin's invasion of Ukraine. It's still buying more Russian oil than any EU member, for instance, and the very fact that Turkey bought S-400s in the first place shows that the country is far from fully aligned with the Western nations that have been more forthright in their condemnations and crackdowns on Russia for the Ukraine invasion. All of this leads to the interesting situation where there is a case for and a case against agreeing to sell Turkey's S-400s back to Russia, at least from the Turkish perspective. We'll start with the case for. As mentioned, Turkey's initial purchase of Russian S-400s was controversial when it was made. The Center for Strategic and International Studies, or CSIS, dug into the issue in a 2019 article, just days after Turkey received the first elements of the S-400s it had purchased 2 years before. Turkey's purchase led to the US threatening to impose both military and economic sanctions on the country, as the move was seen as something of a betrayal of Turkey's NATO membership. After all, though it may not have been outright stated at the time, Russia was NATO's enemy then, as it is now. By purchasing Russian air defense systems, the US argued, Turkey was showing favoritism to that enemy rather than integrating its air defenses with NATO. It's telling that Turkey also considered, though eventually refused, several Western air defense systems before buying the S-400s. CSIS says that the US-made Patriot and French SAMP-T were on Turkey's radar before being rejected. Presumably, Turkey felt that it was getting a better deal with the S-400. Whether it thought that in terms of legitimately believing that Russia's air defense system was better than the other options, or that by making the purchase, Turkey could build stronger ties with the Russian Federation, doesn't matter. What does matter is that Turkey went through with the purchase. And true to its word, the US, under President Donald Trump during his first term, followed through on its sanctions threat. Those sanctions involved the US cutting Turkey out of the F-35 program, even though Turkey offered financial and manufacturing expertise to get that program off the ground. At the time, CSIS suggested that Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan may have been willing to accept the sanctions. But if Erdogan's S-400 decision is driven by fundamental desire to preserve his rule, as a matter, he says, of national sovereignty, then both the loss of the F-35 and CAATSA sanctions may be a price he's willing to pay, CSIS said in 2019. For Turkey, then, the S-400 purchase was a way for Erdogan to put a stamp on his rule, moving the country away from the West through the purchase of systems that NATO would never integrate into its air defenses. However, this desire for national sovereignty created a problem. Earlier we mentioned that Turkey has yet to deploy any of the S-400s it purchased from Russia. The issue, as United 24 Media notes, is that the Russian system isn't compatible with the primarily NATO-aligned defenses present in Turkey. So Turkey might see the sale of its S-400s back to Russia as a way to make some money back from a purchase that ended up being a bust. In the process, Turkey might also hope that getting rid of its S-400s would lead to the US lifting its sanctions, especially the one that prevents Turkey from buying more F-35s. We'll come back to that point later in the video. For now, we can say that Turkey's initial purchase of Russia's S-400 demonstrated its desire to maintain some semblance of a relationship with Putin. Selling S-400s back to Russia on Putin's request might allow Turkey to keep that relationship going while also strengthening its position among its NATO allies. However, Turkey's desire to maintain a relationship with Russia leads us to another reason why the country might consider Putin's S-400 offer. Turkey buys a lot of Russian oil. Some might say too much Russian oil. The Center for Research on Energy and Clean Air, or CREA, highlights the scale of the problem in 2024. During the first half of that year, CREA says Turkey rose from being Russia's 14th largest crude oil customer before Putin kicked off his Ukraine invasion to being Russia's third best customer. While other European nations turning away from Russian oil may have played a role in that fast rise, that doesn't change the fact that Turkey, as a NATO member, is pouring money into Russia's war chest in return for oil. Worse yet, Turkey is complicit in making sure that Russia's oil ends up being imported by G7 countries, CREA says. In the same period, CREA says when referring to the first half of 2024, 3 Turkish refineries have used 1.2 billion euros worth of Russian crude to create oil products that are then being imported by G7 plus countries. 1.2 billion euros amounts to about $1.4 billion, with the issue showcasing how Turkey has turned itself into an intermediary for Russian oil. The relationship is simple. Turkey buys Russian crude oil, often at a cut price due to Western sanctions against Russia's oil industry. Then Turkey uses its refineries to turn that crude oil into usable products such as gasoline and diesel that Turkey then sells on to G7 countries. The nations that may not be willing to buy oil from Russia directly still end up contributing to Putin's oil-based cash flow thanks to Turkey handling the refining on Russia's behalf. At least that's what the relationship seems to be. Politico also reported on this awkward situation, noting that the oil ties between Turkey, Russia, and the European nations to which Turkey sells its refined products are possible because of an oversight in Western sanctions. And it's all legal, Politico declares. The scheme is possible because of a workaround in Brussels sanctions that allows blended fuels into the EU if they're labeled as non-Russian. It's a lucrative loophole, with the research showing that it generated up to 3 billion euros for Moscow from 3 ports alone in the 12 months after the EU banned Russia's fuels in February 2023. Turkey is showing no sign of slowing down with its Russian oil purchases either. In July, Energy Intelligence reported that Turkey is actually going in the opposite direction. It's ramping up. The previous month saw Turkey's purchases of Russian crude rise to 300,000 barrels per day, most of which was Urals blended crude. Turkey imported more Russian crude with those 300,000 barrels per day than it had in over a year, Energy Intelligence reported. We're not telling you all of this to highlight Europe's collective hypocrisy when buying Turkish oil products despite knowing that they're made with Russian oil. That hypocrisy exists, there's no denying that fact. However, the important point to make here is that Turkey is still buying Russian crude at a time when practically all of its NATO and potential future EU allies have pulled away, or at least are in the process of pulling away. Again, it's an example of Turkey trying to play both sides. And that brings us back to Putin's S-400 proposal. Turkey may see an opportunity in this proposal. For instance, it could tell Russia that in addition to whatever cash Putin pays directly for the S-400s,